Welcome to the video series about Bashar al-Assad. In our first video, we will talk about Syria before the civil war. The next video will tell about the civil war period. But first of all, it is necessary to understand the first term of Assad's presidency. Bashar al-Assad was the third child of Hafez al-Assad, a Syrian military officer and member of the Ba'ath Party, who in 1971 ascended to the presidency via a coup. The Assad family belonged to Syria's Alawite minority, a Shiite sect that traditionally constitutes about 10% of the Syrian population and has played a dominant role in Syrian politics since the 1960s. Bashar received his early education in Damascus and studied medicine at the University of Damascus, graduating as an ophthalmologist in 1988. He then served as an army doctor at a Damascus military hospital, and in 1992 moved to London to continue his studies. In 1994 his older brother, Basil, who had been designated his father's heir apparent, was killed in an automobile accident. Bashar, despite his lack of military and political experience, was called back to Syria, where he was groomed to take his brother's place. To bolster his standing with the country's powerful military and intelligence agencies, he trained at a military academy and eventually gained the rank of colonel in the elite Republican Guard. Hafez al-Assad also sought to engineer a positive public image for his son, who until then had lived out of the public eye. Bashar was placed at the head of a popular anti-corruption campaign that resulted in the removal of several officials, but ignored the dealings of senior members of the regime. His image as a modernizer was burnished by his appointment as chairman of the Syrian Computer Society. Hafez al-Assad died on June 10, 2000. Hours after his death, the national legislature approved a constitutional amendment lowering the minimum age for the president from 40 to 34, Bashar al-Assad's age at the time. On June 18, Assad was appointed Secretary General of the ruling Ba'ath Party, and 2 days later the party Congress nominated him as its candidate for the presidency. The national legislature approved the nomination. On July 10, running unopposed, Assad was elected to a 7-year term. Although many Syrians objected to the transfer of power from father to son, Bashar's ascent engendered some optimism both in Syria and abroad. His youth, education, and exposure to the West seemed to offer the possibility of a departure from what had been the status quo, an authoritarian state, policed by a network of powerful overlapping security and intelligence agencies, and a stagnant state-run economy reliant on shrinking oil reserves. In his inaugural speech, Assad affirmed his commitment to economic liberalization and vowed to carry out some political reform, but he rejected Western-style democracy as an appropriate model for Syrian politics. Assad announced that he would not support policies that might threaten the dominance of the Ba'ath Party, but he slightly loosened government restrictions on freedom of expression and the press and released several hundred political prisoners. Those early gestures contributed to a brief period of relative openness, dubbed the Damascus Spring by some observers, in which public political discussion forums emerged and calls for political reform were tolerated. Within months, however, Assad's regime changed course, using threats and arrests to extinguish pro-reform activism. Afterward, Assad emphasized that economic reforms would have to precede political reforms. Assad maintained his father's hardline stance in Syria's decades-long conflict with Israel, continuing to demand the return of the Golan Heights and giving support to Palestinian and Lebanese militant groups. Relations with the United States worsened after Assad denounced the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. Nationalist and anti-Western rhetoric soon became a standard part of Assad's speeches. By 2005, Assad had used a series of cabinet reorganizations and forced retirements to sideline members of the old guard powerful government and military officials held over from his father's administration. They were replaced by younger officials, and many of the most powerful security positions went to relatives of Assad. However, even after this consolidation of Assad's power, his reform initiatives remained tentative and largely cosmetic. Economic liberalization mainly benefited a politically connected elite without helping the many Syrians who depended on the faltering public sector for employment, services, and subsidies. In early 2005, after the assassination of Lebanon's former Prime Minister Rafiq al-Hariri, Assad, under pressure from Western and Arab nations, committed to the removal of Syrian troops and intelligence services from Lebanon, where Syrian forces had been stationed since a 1976 military intervention. Although a United Nations investigation appeared to indicate some level of Syrian participation in the assassination of Hariri, the involvement of the Assad administration was not conclusively determined. In 2007, Assad was re-elected by a nearly unanimous majority to a second term as president through elections generally received by critics and opponents as a sham. In his second term, Assad took some tentative steps toward ending his country's international isolation, seeking to mend relationships with regional powers, including Saudi Arabia and Turkey. In the next video we will talk about the civil war period in Syria. Please subscribe to the channel and like the video. See you later.